It is 2019. It's been 3 years since the 2016 primary. It's a very different primary with far more candidates. And yet there are some things about the two primaries, though years apart, that do seem sort of similar. And the media coverage of certain types of candidates, there is a sort of through line from 2019 stretching back to 2016. And joining us now to break that down, Kate Aronoff, contributor to The Intercept and writing fellow at In These Times. Kate, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you recently wrote an op-ed about the coverage of Bernie Sanders in certain types of outlets. And so talking about 2016 and 2019, what are some of the things that you think are similar, and are there areas where there has been evolution in the coverage of candidacies like Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, I mean, what's still really clear is that most sort of mainstream corporate-controlled outlets are still annoyed by Bernie Sanders. And I think what's evolved this time around is that they're annoyed that he hasn't gone away, right? Like I don't think that most outlets are actively plotting against Bernie Sanders and involved in some sort of underhanded plot to undermine his candidacy. But I do think that they really just don't want to be covering him anymore. And are sort of sick of having to give credence to the Democratic Socialists, having to cover someone who is so consistently sort of challenging much of what they hold dear.
Have you noticed any more representation in these sorts of outlets from writers who come from that side of the spectrum that might identify as Democratic Socialists, who might be a little bit more inclined towards someone like Bernie Sanders or a candidate like him? Are you seeing a little bit more of that sort of representation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one thing that 2016 did was to sort of send the message that the sort of mainstream outlets couldn't just ignore the sort of shifts in the electorate, ignore the fact that people are really supporting candidates like Bernie Sanders. And so you do see more people identifying as Democratic Socialists being invited on, for example, to cable news, more sort of op-eds placed in mainstream publications, but I do think that there is still among the kind of like pundit class who have not, for the most part, sort of changed in personage since 2016. Still, this real sort of fixation on sort of not just saying that their forecasts are totally correct, being kind of unable to acknowledge that this far out we're all sort of likely to be wrong. About what's going to happen 5 or 6 months down the line. But they are, I think, acknowledging the problem in some, with more openness than others.
One of the things that I noticed in the first few months of the primary were, and this sort of gets to the forecasting and the belief that they were always right even when they were proven wrong. In 2016, Bernie Sanders, he was basically alone in terms of some of the policies he was pushing for in the party on healthcare, minimum wage, climate change, all of that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that many of these pundits thought that those ideas were crazy then. And now many of the candidates that they're more inclined to support say that they support those same policies. And there was this thing for a few months where they had to admit that he had pushed the party on those areas, but that was almost used more as ammunition to say, and now you can exit stage left. Is that something that you noticed too?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the kinds of ideas that Bernie was sort of laughed out of respectability for raising in 2016, for instance, things like Medicare for all. There's now a pretty broad acknowledgement, in part bolstered by high polling numbers for these sorts of policies, and the fact that most of the Democratic field is now embracing them. That those are rapidly entering the mainstream and are now the sort of center of the Democratic Party's policy conversation. What I think has happened both in the mainstream media and within the sort of upper echelons of the Democratic Party is kind of what you talked about, which is that people will give Bernie sort of credence for raising these ideas, for pushing them into the mainstream, but then say, well, you've had your time, Bernie, that's great. Now it's time for you to go, and so these other people who were voicing your ideas can take the stage.
In your op-ed, you talk about one other area that this sort of the ideology of the people who are disinclined to be interested in him can manifest, where it's not just in the headlines and the coverage, but also in the debates. I mean, we've only had one so far, and there will be many, but there was definitely a sort of framing of the way that these proposed policies were talked about from the point of view of the moderators. And how would you describe the way they talked about policy debates in the party?
Right, it sort of sounds like it had been written in a lot of the questions that, for instance, people like Savannah Guthrie and Chuck Todd asked during the debate, sort of sound like they were cooked up by like a Republican strategist in 1991. I think those people would be thrilled if these were the questions being asked in the Democratic primary in 2019, if you had asked them back then. So I don't think it's necessarily malicious. I don't think Chuck Todd or Savannah Guthrie or any of the other moderators are sort of consciously even being right wing necessarily, but by asking sort of what kinds of risks student debt cancellation or free college pose to the economy, capital E, that adopts a sort of understanding that there is some risk, to absolving sort of trillions of dollars of student debt, which assumes, I think, that you're speaking from a position of being more friendly to companies like Navient, who of course profit off of student debt, than the many, many more millions of people who are carrying that student debt burden.
Exactly, and of course we'll have many more primaries or debates to see if this continues, but thank you for identifying what you've noticed so far. Kate Aronoff, as always, we appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.